Welcome, everyone. It's an exciting session for us today. This is the very first open mic with the HCL developer session put on by OpenNTF. My name is Graham Akers, and I'm the chair of the board of OpenNTF. And we expect that this is going to develop into a great resource for the community, so quite looking forward to how this plays out. Before we get rolling, I just want to acknowledge quickly the work behind the scenes to put this together, starting with John Paganetti from HCL and Roberto Bocadoro from our own board, and that don't want to diminish lots of other people that have been involved, support from both on the OpenNTF and the HCL side. So thank you to everyone for helping to put this together. Very quickly, we're looking for your feedback. We want to know how you think this plays out, if it works, if there's things that we can tweak or improve. And the best way to do that is through Discord. I'll post the link into the chat in a second here for you to be able to use if you haven't connected to the OpenNTF Discord. And we also have an email address that we've set up for the open mic sessions that David's going to talk about a little bit more, and I'll put that email address in too, but it's openmic@opentf.org. And with that, I am going to hand over to our moderator, who is a longtime member of the community, an HCL ambassador, and the newest member of the OpenNTF board, David Hablowitz. Take it away.
Thank you, Graham. Wow, I'm welcome everybody to the open mic with HCL developers. And I want to say our topic, first of all, is Domino Authentication Protocols. And I'm really excited. It's great to be a part of the board and to have HCL here present. And I wanted to take a moment just to thank everybody who's here. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelists going around the room, and some of them have their cameras on and some of them don't, and that's all right. I'll introduce each of you, starting off first with David Kern. David is the resident expert, or excuse me, David is our resident paranoid, which is good a good trait to have if you're in security, I think, especially as your role as the security architect for HCL Collaboration Solutions and the whole Notes Domino family of products. So Dave, you've been with HCL and with the product experience for about 30 years. In fact, I'm reading here that the field of information security, you've been presenting sessions on security at Lotusphere since 2005, and its derivatives, of course, the other iterations of Lotusphere. And you got extensive industry knowledge and academic experience in cryptography, authentication, authorization, secure systems architecture, and public key infrastructure, as well as the occasional forays into physical security testing, which kind of made me wonder, were you breaking into cars when you were in high school? I'm not sure. Hopefully not. So I wanted to know that everybody's microphone is muted, but don't let that stop you from taking a moment to make a little bit of noise and applaud for our panelists. Now, David, you brought a few people with you today, and looking in our list of panelists, we have Dan Dumont. Dan has been a part of this community since joining IBM back in 2005, and you've been working on security for things like iNotes, Verse, Nomad, and SameTime. And so when you're asking your questions, kind of pay attention, because this is probably the people that you'll be getting the answers from, depending on what their area of expertise is. We also have Bob Paganetti. Bob has been a member of the Domino security team for 29 years. And Bob's been working with a number of features over those years, including ID Vault, S-MIME, certificates, and the CA process. I may have a question for you in a bit, Bob. All right. And then in addition to our topic experts, we've got some product managers here today. I know Annalyn is here, and I'm looking to see if we might at some point not have Tim Clark and Thomas Hample, who are also product managers. And the idea there is when they're listening in, they're actually getting a feel for what your questions are, and that can help with direction. So with that said, a little bit of applause for all of our audience, for our panelists. Thank you. And I'm going to take it over to, did I miss anybody, first of all? I think I've introduced all of our panelists that are here today. So let me take us into the ground rules. Now, ground rule number one, you know where the bathrooms are, so I don't have to tell you. And if you hear a fire alarm, turn down your speaker. And if it doesn't get quieter, get out of there. Otherwise, we're all here for where we are for the questions and answers. Second ground rule. We are recording this, though that doesn't mean we're going to be making this available publicly. Right now, we're still considering that, and we'll wait and see how things go. The value of these sessions anyway is that they are interactive. It's a question and answer, and so the value is to be here and asking your question live. And with that idea, that if you're shy, you may not want to be on camera having your voice recorded or your picture recorded, so we have 3 ways of asking your questions. The first way is to email the open mic at openntf.org. The second way is to type in the questions box, not the chat, but in the questions box. And then I will be pulling the questions from there and reading them for you. And the third way is you want to ask your question yourself, and that's why we're here. And if you want to ask your question on your own, then please still post the question in the question bin that says you want to ask a question. And that way you'll be queued up for that question. And another rule, third rule is 1 question before you go to the back of the line. So please do not, if I'm doing the question on your behalf, that is, you've posted the question in the questions box, then I will keep it to 1 question. But if you do have the mic, if you are talking, please I'm just reminding you that 1 question, and I will cut you off if you start to go down a rabbit hole of other questions. And that's just to be fair, because we have something like 100 people here at least. So this is why we have to moderate this. And then the last one, this is an opportunity to learn about software. This is not a marketing event, so don't look for futures or anything like that. There won't be any things that are that shouldn't be discussed. This is really an opportunity to learn, and that's why we have our experts in the room. So with that, Dave, I'm going to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about more background of what we're doing. Right on? So Dave, take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So I thought that it would be useful to sort of set a little bit of groundwork to help establish a baseline that we can then use for our questions. So when I was first asked about this Ask the Developer session, the topic was security. And well, as you can see here, that's a very large topic. I mean, if you ask someone who is an auditor about security, they'll give you a very different answer than someone who is on the operations team for a cloud service, who will give you a different answer from an end user, who will give you a different answer from a Lotusphere developer. So instead of trying to cover everything that someone might consider to be related to security, we thought we would narrow down on just the topic of authentication, and in particular authentication as it relates to Domino. But I will leave you with one thought on security as a whole. That is that security involves changing your perspective on the world and viewing the world from a different angle. It doesn't involve breaking into cars, as was suggested earlier, but potentially contemplating that chimney vulnerability that Santa Claus manages to exploit one night every year, or wondering, what's on top of that roof, or, do Jeffrey's tubes exist in the real world, and can you actually pass through them? Authentication. We're talking about authentication. And authentication is simple. It's just one bullet out of that giant slide full of bullets, right? I'm afraid not. So I've sort of broken it down here into 2 main categories. We have authentication that occurs within a given protocol. And so that can range from IPsec, which works natively within TCP/IP. TLS has client certificate authentication. You have basic auth, digest auth, bearer auth, and somehow Spinego got shoehorned in there to HTTP itself. You can use public key authentication with SSH. Everyone's favorite Notes RPC has its own public key infrastructure-based authentication. And a little bit of trivia, the Notes PKI was actually the world's largest public key infrastructure for quite a few years before TLS became common across the web, and that PKI became larger than our own. But most people, when they're talking about authentication, they're generally worried about the web. And in that context, they're worried about application level authentication within an HTTP application. So for the column on the right here, this is what someone would consider to be session-based authentication. The user performs an authentication action once, and then they are returned a cookie of some kind that retains that session state. So many of your basic username, password, login forms, you can either supplement that or replace it entirely with a one-time code, ranging from the wildly insecure SMS up through a time-based one-time code generated on your phone. And actually, we've had programmatic one-time codes kicking around since the 1990s in the form of SKey, which is always my favorite in the days before SSH or Kerberized Telnet or anything like that was very common. When you were telnetting into a mail server from an IETF meeting, you could do so without worrying about your password showing up on the big monitor in the computer lab that was sniffing for passwords by using SKey to go through a list of one-time passwords. So some people have started thinking that, okay, TOTP is on the way out. We now have push notifications to mobile devices. Well, those are their problems too. And technically, you can get from a session-based authentication, instead of receiving a single server or single domain session cookie, you can have a session cookie that is shared across many different servers, such as LTPA. In the Domino world, we tend to refer to that as SSO. We then have a couple of your common federated identity methods, SAML and OIDC. And then finally on the list, I have the sort of the new player in the game, passkeys. Passkeys are a type of public key-based authentication, much like SSH, but those keys are generally stored in secure hardware. They've been around for a long time under generally referred to as FIDO2 keys, but they didn't really hit the mainstream until a couple of years ago when Apple, Google, and Microsoft got tired of getting beaten up because every time someone guessed a password of their end users, the media flipped out over Google has been hacked, Microsoft has been hacked, Apple is broken. And, well, no, it's not actually their fault. It's because their users are picking lousy passwords and people are guessing them. And so in an effort to get rid of passwords entirely, the big boys in the industry are moving away from passwords entirely. So let's go back to that topic of passwords again. Passwords are evil. I cannot emphasize this enough. A technique that was designed back in the mainframe days is more of a friendly convenience. You typed in your username and it got to your account, but people picked bad usernames and you could type in the wrong username and end up in someone else's account. So, hey, we came up with a second factor. Let's call it a password. And it wasn't really intended to protect against an attack. It was just a deduplication effort. And somehow these have exploded and gone everywhere, and it's been a nightmare. I mean, simple passwords are very easy to guess, and even countless not-so-simple passwords have been exposed via compromised servers, guessed through a dictionary attack or brute force, and then added to password-cracking dictionaries, thus making them trivial passwords again. And unfortunately, people are expected to remember these passwords, and computers are just so much better at guessing passwords than humans are at remembering them that we end up needing to tell our computers to remember them for us, which kind of defeats the point of using a password in the first place, doesn't it? Now, countless organizations require you to change your password every 90 days. And I would wager that each and every person on this call creates a brand new, completely independent password every 90 days. instead of just incrementing a digit on the old password, right? Right? Yeah, there's no possible reason that capital P password 1 is the most common password in use on the internet, followed by capital P password 2, and so on. You get the drift. Now, speaking of password expiration, I don't know about you guys, but I have enough different passwords, and those password expiration notices are vague enough that I don't actually know which of my passwords is about to expire. So I have to wait until an authentication attempt actually fails and then go back and recover that password and reset it, because I can't proactively manage any of this nightmare, and I'm a professional. So the least bad way to create and remember secure passwords is to not create them and not remember them. Let a secure password manager like the Apple keychain generate a new password for you and autofill it into the correct web origin. And that's important because if the password manager only autofills it into the correct web origin for you, that will protect against a wide variety of different phishing attacks. But unfortunately, I also need to use my Windows box, and copying that line noise equivalent password from Safari into a password manager with, say, Chrome on Windows can be eye-meltingly difficult for those of us with lousy vision. Well, so now we have a long secure password and it's being auto-filled in, but that can still be exposed to an attacker by a wide range of different attacks. So we need to add something to make life even more painful. And that's where, multi-factor authentication comes in. So what do you have? SMS codes? Those are a joke. The SS7 protocol is full of bugs and security holes. It was never designed to be secure. It's trivial to break, and SIM swapping attacks are simple and common. So SMS codes are practically useless. Now, TOTP codes and applications are much better, but still subject to phishing attacks and server compromise. You can type that code into the wrong dialog easily, and then the attacker would have anywhere between 60 seconds and 2 minutes to then copy that string into the real password dialog and log in as you. And so push notifications are supposed to fix that, right? Well, push notification fatigue is a real problem when you're getting pinged constantly by different applications saying, hey, you need to log in again. Hey, you need to log in again. Hey, you need to log in again. Did you say yes to an attacker instead of yes to an unusually chatty application? So what can we do? I mean, to be fair, it is impolite to actually pose a problem and not also pose a potential solution to the problem, or at least a step in the right direction. So that step in the right direction is to centralize your credentials with federated identity. So authenticate to a single centralized identity provider instead of a gazillion different backend servers. So you're at least not multiplying the problem. The two main protocols in use here are SAML, the legacy standard. It's in wide use. If you're using it today, by all means, keep using it. It works fine. If it works for your use cases, keep going. On the downside, it's very web browser centric. It doesn't work well for mobile applications, single page applications, native apps, etc. And it's fairly heavyweight. OIDC is a new standard built on top of OAuth 2.0, connects well with bearer authentication, and it is very friendly towards mobile native single page apps. Lighter weight than SAML, and you've probably seen this in use with login with SAML, login with Apple ID, etc. Most of those social media logins use OIDC. And of course, starting in 12.02, Domino can consume OIDC authentication. And if you've taken a look at our 14.5 early access program, in 14.5 early access 2, you can actually configure Domino to act as an OIDC provider. Now, that's not a forward-looking statement because EA2 is out there and published. Thank you very much. But there are problems even with this. I mean, configuration can be hard, and you don't just have to configure the provider. You also need to configure your application. And if you're configuring multiple applications, they might require different configurations on the provider. So you might be bouncing back and forth between different versions of documentation for different things and configuring multiple different profiles in multiple places. So it can be hard to set up. And you can't federate everything. Some apps just don't support it. And politics can get in the way, because one thing I've heard about from a number of our my friends in the Domino admin business is that like the Windows admins don't like talking to the Domino admins, and so trying to get changes into the Active Directory or configuring something in ADFS can be very hard just because of internal office politics. You know, the cloud guys who control your Google configuration don't want to configure federated identity against your server over here because it's not on the list and you need to get it approved by the right executive, and yeah, life. And from a technical side, you know, each implementation supports a different subset of the standard, sorry. And if you're Microsoft, you might not even support a subset of the standard. In their infamous embrace and extend approach, they can, you know, add their own modifications to the standard, thus leading to all of the you know, requests that I've gotten since we introduced OIDC support in 12.02 for, hey, Microsoft's B2C approach is adding this new thing that isn't part of the standard, but you need to do this other special thing to work with them. And of course, every implementation is configured differently. You know, configuring Google as an identity provider is different from Microsoft, is different from Apple, is different from Okta, is different from Keycloak, and every application has their own approach. So trying to sort all of this out and configuring all of these different products against different providers can be a nightmare. And of course, passwords are still evil. But we have a new hope, at least in the password front. So as I mentioned before, passkeys are something new and exciting, and they involve key-based authentication rather than having a password. That key is stored in secure hardware, so it can be stored in the secure enclave chip on your iPhone or in your Mac. It can be stored in the DRM, you know, containers in your Windows box. Android has their own equivalent to the secure enclave. And Chrome and some other browsers are actually, you know, either leveraging the platform's secure hardware storage or leveraging that to build their own encrypted store on top of it. So these passwords are stored securely. So that's something you have, the secure hardware. And in order to unlock it, you need, you know, Face ID or Touch ID. You need a fingerprint, something you are, or something you know, such as a PIN or a password to unlock that secure hardware. So these passkeys are innately multi-factor. This means you're not dealing with a password and a code or a password and a push notification. Just a passkey will give you that full multi-factor authentication. And it will, and in the latest NIST specs, passkeys are actually rated at their highest level of compliance. So you can meet the highest level of NIST authentication standards with a passkey as a single factor of authentication, thanks to that innate multi-factor nature. Now, because it's a key, not a password, you don't have a password. That means you don't need to change it every 90 days. You don't have a second factor, so you don't need to dig up your phone and pull it off the charger and unlock it and find the right page and open the right folder and open the right application and, you know, unlock that application and get your code and type it in or confirm the push notification. All of that's gone. It's just one touch on the touch sensor and you're in. Now, passkeys are private keys. It's not a shared secret or a password. So that means the server is only storing public keys. So if the server is compromised, the passkey is still safe. There's nothing that can be leveraged in an attack or even used to authenticate to that same server. And because the passkey is never sent anywhere, the private key remains in the secure hardware. Um, there's no way to actually expose it to an attacker. And because the web browser and the engine will only expose it to the correct origin, it is completely immune to the human side of phishing attacks. It can't be sent to the wrong site. Now, each relying party website, or set of websites, you can configure them for a subdomain instead of each individual origin has its own unique passkey. You don't need to worry about information sharing or bleeding across sites. And so with all of this power and security, why didn't they become widely used a long time ago? Because simple FIDO2 credentials could do this many, many years ago. And the answer to that is that when you were only configuring your credentials on USB keys and you put your USB key in your pants pocket and it runs through the laundry, you're now completely locked out of everything. So, okay, you need to now buy 2 keys or maybe 3 to have a backup. And now every time you log into you configure a new site, you need to go and configure multiple different passkeys with all of your different USB tokens. And okay, you want to keep one of those tokens in a fire safe and maybe one in an offsite backup. So now when you're setting up a new website, you need to go and gather these tokens from different places, and the management headache is pretty massive unless you're a major organization issuing them to your employees, and then you can just easily reissue a new token to someone who lost their old token. But the big differentiator between that FIDO2 token is that in the WebAuthn level 3, the latest version of the spec, these passkeys can now be securely shared within an ecosystem. So within like your Apple keychain, all of your iOS and macOS devices have access to all of your passkeys. Register a passkey on your phone, buy a new phone, it's there. It's on your Mac. Similarly with Windows 11, log into your Windows account. It'll be there on your other Windows 11 devices. Ditto with Android. It's being shared across your account. So it'll come with you across your different devices, and you have that innate backup capability. And additionally, you can use these roaming authenticators, things like USB tokens, YubiKeys, and your mobile devices. You can use that. You can use Bluetooth or something similar to use your iPhone to authenticate on your Windows box, for example. And of course, because you have secure hardware, that's going to protect against device theft. Someone stealing your phone isn't going to have access to your passkeys because they don't also have your thumbprint. And even folks like the NSA and the FBI have a really hard time breaking into iPhones. So you don't have to worry as much about random guy who pulled your phone out of your pocket managing to get into your websites. I'm sorry if my rant ran a little bit longer than expected there, but I just wanted to set a simple baseline for the conversation and sort of let you know where my thoughts were at the moment, sort of give you a space on my headspace. And of course, some disclaimers before we get into the Q&A proper. I'm not in product management or offering management, so I can't make any commitments on behalf of HCL. Anything that sounds like a promise or a forward-looking statement is almost certainly a lie or something derived from all of the cold medicine that I'm hopped upon at the moment. So my apologies if I sound definitive or authoritative in any fashion whatsoever. I'm just some useless, yokel here doing my best.
I appreciate that, and I think you're going to prove your knowledge right here as what you've shown right here. This actually was really good to help seed the questions, and I did get a different first question, which makes me happy because I love to give the opportunity for others to get in here. And the first question that we have coming from online is from Paul. He gives a little background to the question first. In Domino 14, the passkeys database maintains user-specific records for every authenticator that the user has ever used on that system in order to create a passkey. Over time, the number of these records will likely grow to include records for authenticator devices no longer used or lost or faulty, etc. So my question is, users do not have access to the passkeys database, so have you considered allowing them to access to this database, either directly or indirectly, in order to allow them to self-manage their authenticator records, rather than having to delegate this task to an administrator, which he probably means is me? Or do you have other thoughts about how managing this would work better in the future?
So I'll start off with what you can do today. And one of the things that you can see in the passkey database is when a passkey was last used for authentication. So one thing that administrators can do fairly easily is look for unused passkeys or passkeys that haven't been used in a long time and go through and delete those records to sort of maintain it manually on their own. That said, I do think that it would be a great idea for end users to be able to self-manage their own passkeys, and I would love it if someone would bring that up into offering management and help us get it through the triage process. So, great idea. I like it a lot.
Thank you, David. And I know when you say bring it up to management, there's that great tool, I want to say AHA, the place where you can post ideas and then get them voted up and get them presented. So, in fact, we might drop the URL for that in there. If one of my partners could go and grab the AHA URL, drop that into the chats. I do have another question. Good. Simon asks a question. Is there any update on Domino supporting TLS v1.3? Does it, after all, have, it does have, after all, 263 votes in the Domino ideas. So it looks like a rather popular topic. TLS v1.3? Any feedback on that?
It is definitely top of mind. I would love to get that into Domino. I can say that it is not in 14.5 early access 2, which is as far forward as I can speak. But it is very high on our list. I can tell you that.
Awesome. Well, obviously it's high on everybody's list there, so hopefully we'll see that coming in soon. And as I wait for a question, I will go ahead and ask my question. And that is, I ran into this problem just recently. I have a pair of servers that are clustered. One of them happens to be in Los Angeles. And while the fires did not burn it down, they managed to protect the building from the fires that surrounded it. They did lose power. They had to shut everything down. And that server, we don't know when we're going to be able to bring that back online. And that server happened to have my certificate authority. So with this cluster, the question is, can I install or set up this certificate authority on the cluster mate? And what kind of ramifications come with that? Or is it like one server only? I did look for documentation on this and didn't find anything that really set that. So if anybody would like to jump in and say yes or no, or what we can do with the certificate authority, I'd appreciate it.
Bob, could you take that one, please?
Yeah, I think the CA process is usually tied to one particular server, so you configure it on a particular server, and that's where it runs. That way, you don't have two competing servers trying to process certificate requests and running into issues of doing duplicate stuff and trying to see who wins. So I believe, and I'd have to go back and check that I don't think you can migrate a CA process from one server to another, but you may be able to. I'd have to get back to you on that and check the documentation on the CA process. Dave, do you recall anything different than that?
I appreciate that. Yeah, the challenge I have is this server will come back, and so I don't even want to think of just installing it on there without it creating problems later on down the road. So you got my email address. And speaking of, if you do have questions,
Dave,
go ahead.
Dave, did you submit an AHA idea for that?
Well, this just came up, and so I'm just doing the research. And I wanted to make sure that I have a full understanding of this because I had never encountered this before. And so
Okay.
I haven't seen any conversation on it. And yeah, you'll probably see an aha on it if we don't have a solution for that. Certainly.
Yeah, so you're like asking if there's a way to export a CA process certifier and then import it onto another server and have it be protected by that server's keys so it can run there. And I don't think that's a feature that we offer currently. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically being cluster aware is what I'm after.
And a good practice, if you can't find the answer in the documentation, is open a support case and with HCL support, and they'll go through the right process, and it'll get to development if it needs be. And if they'll come back and say you need to open an AHA idea, it's a great way to progress things like that. So good question. Obviously a situation, real world situation, and something we could look at.
Appreciate that. Well, I think I have another. No, I'm waiting on another question. So there are opportunities, folks, for your chances to get some good questions in here. I am seeing that we have an opportunity for our product manager to respond, and perhaps Graham, if you can check in the chat and see if we can help Annalyn to get that message out to everybody in the chats.
Yep.
Meanwhile,
Handled.
did we get any questions in the email address? And I don't think that we have. And while we're here live, it's a lot easier to put it in the chat.
No, we don't.
No, nothing.
No? Well, Roberto, you said no, we don't, but I know you've got a question.
Yes, I have a question that maybe look trivial, but I'm playing with setting up passkeys in Domino. So far, so good, but I heard that Traveler does not work with passkeys. There is not passkey support in Traveler. Is it true? I haven't tested it yet, so before doing some horrible mistake, I'd like to have a confirmation.
The Traveler client does not currently support passkeys.
Thanks.
The Domino server does, and you can configure the Domino server to support both, username password authentication and passkey authentication. So that's sort of where I'd recommend people go as a starting point. Enable both and allow end users to start using the newer, more secure approaches, and then let it, shake out a little bit, see how it works, see what feedback you get, see what kind of mix you're getting between password-based authentication and passkey-based authentication, and take it from there.
Okay, it's a forward-looking question, so you're not going to answer, but I assume that since passkeys is the future, the plan is to support it everywhere, even in the Traveler client and all the various facets of Domino, right?
I assume that is a question for the product managers on the call and not for me.
Right. No worries. Thank you, Roberto, for that question. Which, by the way, when you say we may not be an important question, the only question that's a dumb question or anything like that is the one that doesn't get asked. And no matter how trivial or how complex, this is a great place to get that question in. So I have another question in the queue, and this again comes from Simon. Thank you, Simon, for stepping in with your question. A while back, the direction appeared to be that HCL wanted everyone to have an ID file and to move away from just person docs with an HTTP password, i.e. The TOTP required users to be in the ID vault. Is this still a long-term ambition for HCL, or are secondary directories containing people with only an HTTP password a strategic option again?
Well, that depends on what set of functionality you really are trying to invoke. So anything that involves, secure mail or encryption, you're going to need an ID file, obviously. And if we're going to try to store something secure within Domino for a given user, the ID vault is the place where that's probably going to live. So that's why you need the ID vault and an ID file for TOTP, simply because the TOTP shared secret lives in the user's ID vault entry, encrypted with all of the same magic as the ID file in the ID vault. So it was the place where we could lock that down and be the most secure for that secret. And so like that's one of the reasons why you can do like passkey authentication for you know, a user that might only exist in a secondary directory, simply because you know, we create the passkey database doesn't need to be hardened as much. It doesn't matter if someone sees what's in the passkey database because all that's in there are the public keys. There's nothing truly secret in that database.
So Dave, I have a question
Sure.
for you. So even if you're using passkeys, you recommend that the user has an ID in the ID vault, correct?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And if you're creating a user, give them an ID file, put them in the ID vault. Life will be much simpler and cleaner that way. And really, we've built the product on a strong infrastructure of, you know, security on that PKI from day one. So having users without ID files doesn't make a great deal of sense to me in that regard.
So I see we have our Nomad server expert on the panel, and Dan Dumont. Dan, what are you seeing as far as what's coming in for the field of what type of authentication is being used by customers using Nomad Web? I know we test internally pretty much all the protocols, but what do you see as a trending?
I see a lot more people configuring it for SAML using Nomad Federated Login, and we recently released OIDC support, so hopefully we'll see that too. I don't see many support cases on that, so either it works flawlessly, or people haven't really started that yet, but I imagine they will soon.
And on that topic, another thing I'd like to highlight from Early Access 2 and from 14.5 Early Access 2 is that we were actually, I've actually heard from the field that one of the reasons that many people have stuck with SAML or actually set up new SAML installations instead of using OIDC is because they could use SAML to authenticate to the Notes ID vault, and you couldn't use OIDC to authenticate to the ID vault. But if you set up the 14.5 Early Access Drop 2, there's actually a new configuration setting that you can use in order to have that web federated login with OIDC to the ID vault. So you can go in with Verse and authenticate with OIDC and gain not just access to the HTTP server, but the user's ID file stored in the Verse cache for secure mail operations. Again, another push for try out the early access too, and give us feedback in the early access forums.
Thank you, David. By the way, for anybody listening, that you don't have to type your question in. You can simply type in the questions, I have a question, and then you can ask your question live. It's a lot easier to do it that way sometimes than it is to actually type in, especially if it's a question where you're not even sure how to ask it. So consider that as you're thinking about those questions you have related to security. And while we're saying that, I have a question. And my question is less technical and more of strategic. I work with a lot of companies that are medium and even really small. They may only have a few users. At what point, what is the threshold where it is worth the investment to do this process? Because there is overhead. So as we're going down these new authentication methods with that, at what point do you say, yes, do this? Or do you say, everybody should have this?
I would say start early. I mean, if you have 5 users, um, buy like a 10 pack of YubiKeys or something and hand one out to each of your employees, make them register a passkey and have them use that. Start from the beginning with only the secure approaches. As there are many large corporations are actually doing that to help protect against attacks on their infrastructure. It's like Google, for example, has issued USB tokens for authentication to all of their employees. So they're not using passwords anymore. They're just using passkeys.
Mm-hmm. So really,
And they're
there
not the
isn't
only
any,
one.
so there really isn't a minimum number that you would have. You would have that as small a unit of company as you have. Good.
Right.
Good. That's good to know.
And on a personal basis, I've been enabling passkeys on every website where I can. It makes me feel much better when I can log into a banking site or an investment site using a key stored securely in secure hardware rather than a long pseudo-random string that might be compromised through a database attack of some kind or another.
Mm-hmm. You make a good point there too, and that is right now in this particular forum, we're all thinking business and enterprise and things like that, but this is actually a consumer level experience as well, that we are all consumers of this, whether we're doing it through work or just in our own. So that's a really good point, and that it does kind of bring it home to that security touches us throughout our world, not just at work.
Mm-hmm. And even for those of you who are working with like third-party identity providers, if you're working with, a Keycloak or an Okta or, a Google identity provider, you can configure passkeys on all of those. Mm-hmm. So you can use a passkey to authenticate to that identity provider and then use that, SAML or OIDC authentication from there to all of your other services. That sort of gives you the best of both worlds. You have federated identity and you're logging into that identity provider securely. Actually, something I'd like to share briefly if I can. So forward secrecy, very, nerdy topic here. I'm sure it's completely unimportant and of no relevance to anyone's day to day, other than the fact that, in the picture right there, you can see the rather massive data center where it is believed all of the internet traffic flowing through the United States is being recorded. So in the past, we thought that encryption was a nice to have thing. We thought it was, an optional, something you might want to have just for banking or just for things that truly matter. But we have, actual hard evidence now that there are, persistent threats out there who are recording all of your traffic. And due to the way TLS is designed, if you're not using forward secrecy, the client generates what's called a pre-master secret, a big random number, sends it over to the server encrypted with the server's private key. And so that data center can record years, decades even, of encrypted traffic going to and from a server. And then at some point they can decide, hey, I want to know about this communication that occurred 3 years ago. They go in, they nab that server's private key, and they can now retroactively decrypt any conversations they want that have ever occurred with that server. Now, I don't know about you, but that thought terrifies me. And so that's where forward secrecy comes in. It adds a either Diffie-Hellman, ephemeral Diffie-Hellman or ephemeral elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman exchange into the protocol, such that an eavesdropper in the middle someone who later manages to acquire the server's private key, or even, the user's private key. If you're doing TLS client authentication, they cannot get that pre-master secret. They cannot rederive that ephemeral value. And so your communication is protected not just now, but in the years and decades to come. Now, my slides here are talking about TLS, as this is an old deck from, I guess, 2017. But after this became a major concern, I started working on adding forward secrecy into Notes RPC as well. Now, NRPC doesn't have quite the same vulnerability to this type of attack as TLS did, because in NRPC, the server sends the encrypted, pre-master secret equivalent to the client rather than the other way around. So the bad guy would need to grab all of the user ID files as opposed to just grabbing one server ID file to have that same impact. But in fact, starting in one of the 9.0x versions, we added support for forward secrecy to NRPC, and in recent releases, it's actually been enabled by default. So please upgrade your servers, upgrade your clients. There are real differences here, real layers of protection that we've added against real world threats. And just because it isn't shiny and new and doesn't come with bells and whistles, it's important. So
thank you, David. Yeah, actually, when you said that, and you said how well Notes has had this for a long time, it always brings back to me how innovative Notes has been throughout. I've even posted a blog article on the innovations that have come, and this once again demonstrates that we don't see it in other things. We'll see it here first in a lot of cases, which is really cool that it's native to it.
I have a question for Dave. There is, I'm talking about SSO, namely the infamous LTPA token, which is a bit outdated as a technology. Are there any plans to replace single sign-on through LTPA token with something else in the near future, or are we still stuck with that?
Yes, there are definitely plans to get rid of LTPA. And we've actually had the ability to, so the LTPA token, I mean, the full name of that is really the WebSphere LTPA token. It was initially added for, they were being generated by WebSphere, by IBM WebSphere, and for interoperability with IBM WebSphere. And you saw support for that WebSphere LTPA token spread out across, a whole variety of different products of IBM origins. And now that we're not with IBM anymore, we're not, not under the same constraints that we were to support certain, obsolete, insecure technologies that we were required to in the past. So, a far better approach would be to use federated identity. So a user logs into a single identity provider, they authenticate once, and then each of the different backend servers, instead of being configured to support LTPA, they're each configured with single server session cookies and with either SAML or OIDC based authentication. So the user logs into the identity provider, they log in once, they have that single login experience, and then each of the backend servers that would have consumed LTPA instead consumes either a SAML assertion or an OIDC ID token.
And since 14.5 will be live, Domino will be an OIDC provider, so I can authenticate against it.
Right.
Rather than having to set up an Active Directory or whatever, because My customers, for example, not all of them, thank God, are using Microsoft Active Directory. So they need to have an IDC provider, and having Domino in-house would be cool to use it.
Yeah, I am thrilled that we got the green light for 14.5 to add identity provider support into Domino. It's something we've been wanting to add from a technical perspective for years, but we finally got the green light to actually go ahead and dedicate the time to doing it right. And so because we want to do it right and we want to actually satisfy all of your requirements, again, I will emphasize download the early access builds and give us feedback on the early access forums, because I would rather hear, now, hey, you're doing this thing in a way that doesn't work, or you're not interoperating with X, or I'm having problems configuring it with Y. I want to solve that now before 14.5 ships, rather than having you tell me, oh, the gold build has this problem. And then, okay, now we need to wait for the next release to actually address it. So, now is the time to provide that feedback. And sorry, one supplemental note on your LTPA question. One of the pieces of feedback I've heard about why some people have stayed with LTPA instead of using federated identity is because if you have multiple Domino servers serving a single internet site, so you have, for example, www.example.com being served across 4 different clustered Domino servers, each of those Domino servers would play whack-a-mole on the other single server session cookie, because they all had the same name and the same web origin. But they each were being maintained in in-memory session tables on each Domino server. And so in order to solve that problem, they needed to use LTPA, so that single cookie would be consumed by all 4 of the Domino servers, for example. We added a new configuration variable in NoteCine in 12.02 to make unique single server session cookie names. So if you turn that on, instead of having every single server session cookie be named a DOM-off SesID, the cookie will now have roughly the first, another 10 characters or so appended to the end of it, which are based on a hash of the Domino server name. So you can have multiple clustered Domino servers serving the same internet site, all using their own unique single server session cookies and not conflicting with one another. And
Thanks
so
a
the
lot.
reason we haven't turned that on by default is because we've heard tale of people having like reverse proxy rules built that have that DOM-off SesID cookie name hard-coded into it. And we wanted to give people time to expand or fix those rules before flipping the default. And so if anyone on the call does have those any sort of dependency on that cookie name, please, speak up now, either in the channel or on Discord or in the meeting or over through the email feedback, and let us know.
Yeah.
Good to hear. Thank you, David. I would like to bring your attention, everyone, to the chat. Graham did post a poll question. We'd love to hear from you. This is our first iteration of this, and we want to do many more of these. The value comes from the questions and the answers to the questions and the dialogue that gets brought up for everybody to hear. And with that, we want to make sure that we're not scaring anybody off. And speaking of scaring off, I know a lot of times people are gun shy, myself included. We all fall to this, is that you don't really know a whole lot about the subject, and you don't want to open your mouth and make it well known how much you don't know. Are there any places that you might direct people who feel like they know nothing about all of these acronyms, the OIDC, the SSL, all of these things? Where would you suggest that people go as a starting point to begin to learn, to expand their knowledge on this, so that they feel like they can ask an intelligent question in here? Or John, you might even have some ideas on where we might find that first starting point, that launch point for getting to know this stuff well enough to speak to the subject?
Well, I try to say, and again, I was really surprised for the mobile team sent me a link to the admin guide talking about the different authentication protocols that they support. It was incredibly detailed. I was very impressed. Maybe we can share that more broadly, and we have to do a better job internally for each of our clients, making sure they all similarly state, the different protocols they support and what they are, and in such a way that someone would feel comfortable reading it. I'll give from my own experience when Dave said he was ready to test passkeys in our internal production domain. I was like, what the hell is that? And next thing you know, I've registered. I didn't even know I had a finger reader on my laptop, and I registered it, and we started playing with it. And as soon as I saw the benefit of it, and of course I had to yell at Dave because it was way too complex on how you logged in using it. And he has, and I especially asked people to try it out in 14.5 to give feedback, because they really simplified the usage of it. The login dialog boxes, you're going to have this one-time setup that you're going to have to get past, and then after that, it's just prompts you, and you just put your finger on the finger reader, and you're in, and you're securely in, which is just amazing for what it takes. And then all of a sudden I realized, I can log into my Windows OS with the thing I just set up. So I come in, wake up in the morning, I get my coffee, I hit my mouse, and I put my finger on the finger reader, and I'm into Windows OS, and there's notes, and maybe I have Verse up, and I have to go in, or I bring Verse up, and I easily can just use my finger reader to get into Verse securely. It's just amazing, the potential and possibilities. And Dave and team have really done a nice job of dumbing those things down. Of course, what's my next question to Dave? Do you support clustering? Will this work if one of the place where my passkey database is down, or I can't get to it? And of course, Dave immediately starts working on that. He may be able to speak a little bit to how that would work today. I think we still have to work on setting it up in our own environment. But we want to make it redundant so that, a single server being down doesn't impact your usage of passkeys. So we're always thinking about that. And I get to sit in on a developer design review of something that they're adding, because customers are asking, they want to be able to force all of their users to use passkeys and not be able to come in with a password. Usually my Windows machine, if I can't get in with my finger, it says, oh, you have a PIN that you added? You want to use the PIN? Oh, you don't have a PIN. You want to use a password. It gives them the 3 outs. But some customers who really want to be secure can actually configure it so that it just is going to require the passkey to get in. That's something that's been asked, and it's something he's added to the 14.5 work list to be able for admins to configure that way. So lots of good stuff happening in that area. I think Dave wasn't biased in saying the way he's leaning for people. The existing technologies that we have today all work. If you a lot of the time support calls are setting and configuring things up. You run into problems. We try and simplify it, give your feedback through support. If you ran into issues, we take that feedback and try and incorporate it and make it real simple to set up these things. And we still know there's still a ways to go. There's still a ways to go on some things.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I actually have another question in the queue, so if we can go a little further here. By the way, I'll say, if you want to ask your question yourself, if you feel like you can do it better than I can, feel free to just say, open the mic for me. But I will read this one. It comes from Serdar. A decade ago, I shamelessly created a hacky script to create LTPA token for a customer and shared it on OpenNTF snippets. Since then, it's been used around many times for many reasons, including remember me function on web. Of course, this might be a massive security breach in the wrong hands, and LTPA token is not great tech. But it has interesting use cases, such as automatically authenticating a notes user for a Domino HTTP resource. Anyway, the question is that what can be done for such use cases where developers need to play with the authentication mechanisms?
if you're talking about like federated identity type methods, then some of the public providers out there, allow you to create test accounts, and like Google has a sandbox, for example, where you can work on configuring authentication against their identity provider. In the current early access for 14.5, you can use Domino as an identity provider. And one great thing I like to use when playing around with my own test domains for Domino is the cert manager and the cert store. In particular, a little known feature called the micro CA that we added initially for internal use by our own test team, and then ended up exposing it in the product as an actual feature just because it was that useful. And it allows you to, with just a couple of clicks in the cert store, to create a little trusted root of your own, and then create TLS credentials so you can make your internet sites TLS protected on a test system or a dev system almost immediately. And this is important because most of these new authentication methods don't allow you to run them over a plain text connection. They require TLS. And if you don't have TLS set up, it's just a non-starter. And so that, in my mind, is sort of the biggest blocker to developers playing with many of these new techniques, is that they need to have TLS set up on their website. And so to that wit, I would recommend looking at the cert manager, and in particular the micro CA functionality. And I might even be able to demo that in a few moments if you like.
Okay, thank you, David. Hopefully, sir, that answered your question. If not, give a response there or drop in the chat, then we can open the mic for you that you can elaborate on your question. What I'll ask is, David, you had something else you wanted to share with us, kind of in closing, if we will, as we bring this to a wrap this up. Let me give you that opportunity to go ahead and share what you wanted to share with us.
I've been talking about, configuration difficulties. Can you see my notes client here?
Yes.
So I'm in the notes client in the IDP catalog database. If you guys have been playing with single sign-on, you've no doubt suffered through this a great deal. But and this is the early access version of the database. You can see the OIDC provider stuff in it. So, but if you haven't played with federated identity because it was too complicated to set up, that may have been because you were looking at the old like SAML-based configuration. I mean, look at all of the things here that you need to configure. There are a whole slew of different URLs. You have XML files to import and export. You have certificates that you can need to manage and possibly import into ID files. The steps for configuring a SAML partnership are fairly extensive. Again, if you have it configured and working, by all means, it's fine. Keep using it. Use what works. But if you don't have federated identity set up, one of the reasons I've heard for people not setting it up is because of the complexity. And looking at, here's the client side of an OIDC partnership. You have one URL right here. That gives you all the information you need about the provider, because off of that we can find the published well-known endpoint and published keys, and keys can be updated dynamically. Everything is right there. And then you have a client ID and a client secret for which the Domino server in this case uses to after getting the authorization grant from the end user, uses that to exchange for the tokens used to log the user into Domino. So those are the only, truly necessary bits of information on that entire form.
Great. While we've been talking,
simpler.
Yes, we've gotten a couple of questions, and I want to try to squeeze these in before we're done. I have 2 questions in here. So the first by Christian. Let me make sure I'm reading this from the beginning. it was and is one of the biggest problems with Domino products, that all these new and fantastic security options are not available in all clients and add-ons and OS. As a result, passwords are still there because HCL is not able to provide a modern mechanism in all the offerings. I'm not sure that's a question. But I think this is a point we're making, is that just looking for the consistency of having this work across all OSs and tools. Kristen, if you wanted to elaborate on that, feel free to drop another question in there as a question that I can work with and share with them. And then finally, here we have from MK. How realistic is the scenario now to use the OIDC with Microsoft Entra ID provider, or is it better to wait for the Domino 14.5 version if you've got that option?
So the first question first. I know that we've had issues in the past with adding support into core Domino and having a certain amount of lag before the different clients pick it up. We've been trying to address that more directly in the current cycle, and that's why we've had people from the client team sort of trying to get on the panel here to help answer questions. We've been working closely with some of our client teams in-house to try to ensure that we will have good alignment when 14.5 comes out, with some of our clients having support for the new functionality. And we're really looking to get better alignment moving forward as well, just generally across the board. And I forgot the second question.
Well,
Sorry.
it was, should we wait for 14.5?
Right. Who you use as your identity provider? I mean, as a good, HCL employee and advocate, I should say, by all means, absolutely use HCL products over any other one, under all circumstances. But, practically speaking, in the real world, if you're doing all of your user management currently through, Microsoft, AD, through Azure AD, or Intra AD, as I think they're calling it now, then if you're already authenticating against web apps using that, it makes sense to keep that single authentication experience and then also use that to authenticate against your Domino servers. If you are not currently using that, if you don't currently have your authentication credentials up in Microsoft, then, sure, if you can wait a couple months, then you can wait for to have Domino be that primary source of authentication. And one thing that you can actually do is you can chain identity providers. One thing that I've been testing carefully is to ensure that the Domino OIDC provider in they can see in the early access programs is running on a Domino internet site. And you can configure that Domino identity provider to accept whatever form of authentication is configured for that internet site, including SAML and OIDC. So you can put a Domino identity provider, or will be able to, well, you can now with the early access program, you know what I mean, caveat supply, etc., behind a SAML provider or an OIDC provider. So you could have Microsoft Intra asserting identities to the Domino OIDC provider, which then asserts them in turn to things in-house. And that kind of two-tier setup might actually be easier to deploy and configure from a configuration perspective or a political perspective. So if it's very hard for you to get your Microsoft admins to touch anything on the Microsoft side of the house, get them to configure one partnership against one Domino internet site and put a Domino identity provider on that site, and then use that one against your backend. So that'll be easier to configure and update partnerships and dynamically change things over time. So
Great.
we're trying to provide as much flexibility as we can.
Thank you, David. And now I have a final question. We've got less than 5 minutes left before we're going to wrap this. So with this final question, can we expect support for Apple as a IODC provider in Domino 14.5?
I hope so. I've had that task sitting in my backlog since 14.0. Apple doesn't quite follow the OIDC standard. They use sort of a hybrid between the client secret post and the private key JWT authentication mechanisms. So we'd need to build a sort of a custom, Apple ID authentication mechanism that would do the slightly different thing that they do. And that hasn't percolated its way up to the top of the backlog yet. But I dearly hope we can get it into 14.5, but I can't make any promises. But if you actually have, deployments in the field and you actively want to use that, that's good, customer feedback that I can help use as ammo to push that higher on the backlog.
Certainly.
Well, the originator of the question says that he would volunteer to test, and you know it. You know also who the question comes from, I guess. So
You can just make random guesses. Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. And I will have this little clock that's ticking down, and it's saying we're down to the final less than 5 minutes before this goes poof. But I wanted to say, first of all, this has been delightful. I've really enjoyed hosting this opportunity here and to be part of OpenNTF. And thank you, David, and your team, Bob and Dan and John, and all of you over there at HCL for being willing to step up and do this with us. I wanted to remind everybody that we're planning to do this on basically a monthly process with the availability of folks as well and having the topics. If there are topics you'd like to hear, have us do, please share them with us. And remember that this doesn't just happen, and that the people that are on the board really are no different than you, and that it doesn't matter what your skill level is or anything like that. It takes a little bit of effort to put this together, but if you consider stepping in and participating with us at OpenNTF, you'll have an opportunity to work even in the background with these folks and learn a lot more than just waiting for things like this to happen to you. So consider that, reach out to us. Doesn't matter your level of expertise. We'd love to have you join in with us at OpenNTF. And unless there's anything else, I want to say cheers. Graham, I'll hand it back to you to close the door. I appreciate everybody.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Again, just reiterating what Dave said, we need your feedback. We need to know if this was good, if this wasn't good, what we could do different, what topics you're looking for. Thank you to everybody who answered the poll question, and we'll take that feedback and come back with a better session next month. And with that, yeah, let's wrap it up. But thanks everybody for your participation today, and especially Dave and the team at HCL for answering all the questions. Take care, and we will see you next time.